So I am here as a private citizen, and I list a couple of things here to give you some information about my background. I'm the BB&T Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Kentucky. I was there for 36 years teaching economics and being at various administrative duties, and I'm also affiliated with the Bluegrass Institute. But I issue this disclaimer that the assessments and views that I express here and in the companion report that's on the website are my own and should not be perceived as representing those of my former employer, the University of Kentucky. So I'm going to start out with just talking about some economics, as perhaps some on the committee don't want to talk about, at least market competition economics, but then also talking about the economics literature, as well as other healthcare research literature on certificate of need. So economic analysis competition is an important force in economic analysis that generates lower prices, better quality, and more efficiency. And competition perhaps may seem as a bit of a harsh word, but really it amounts to, it's one side of the coin to consumer choice. So if you have competition, that means consumers have choices, and that's an important factor in how well businesses do. If they don't satisfy their consumers, consumers can then have alternatives. So that's important from the consumer's perspective. So any interference with the competitive process, a lot of economists think, is presumptively harmful. And certificate of need laws fit this as presumptively dubious because it impedes with the entry of competitors into the marketplace and obviously the provision of more services to consumers and blocks potential entrepreneurs from coming into the marketplace. However, this presumption can be rebutted in particular cases with sufficient evidence and reasoning to overcome that presumption. Now, to preview what I'm about to say here, my assessment is, after reviewing the evidence, that the arguments in favor of certificate of need do not rebut its anti-competitive harmfulness. So let me note here, though, that there are an assorted legal, governmental, and private institutions that support market competition in healthcare as well as other markets, and that's, of course, the desire of individual providers to not only compete right now, but to have consumers in the future to build a good reputation for having high-quality provision. But there's also legal liability for negligent treatment of patients and negligent selection and supervision of employees. There's also, and so it's important to have a well-functioning legal system that effectively sorts out legitimate malpractice claims from the false ones, so that consumers are better served, as well as the honest providers want to retain their reputation, obviously, and ferret out the dishonest ones. Malpractice insurance, even though it has its flaws, it provides incentives for insurers as well as the insured to promote quality care. And there's lots of certifications of healthcare professionals that assist providers in vetting their employees. So again, to review a little bit, my reading of the evidence implies that certificate of need laws do not generally augment or support these practices or institutions. So really add nothing to this legal, governmental, and private set of institutions that promote competition and service to consumers. So I'm going to talk about the evidence regarding the effects of certificate of need. And I'm going to take a minute here to talk about the methodologies that are used and the appropriate methodologies so that we aren't comparing apples to oranges. We want to make apples to apples, or analysts want to make apples to apples comparisons as close as possible. So ultimately, this involves comparing states and outcomes in states and hospitals and providers that do have certificate of need to those without, and by various means such as costs, provision of care, quality of outcomes, and so on. Now, it's important, obviously, to adjust for relevant differences across states or across healthcare markets, such as income, poverty rates, cost of living, and so on, underlying morbidity, and other demographics. So more data on those things, the better the study is. Also, many studies allow each state its own baseline and examine changes after certificate of need is, or some parts of certificate of need is removed. So rather than trying to ferret out why Kentucky might be less healthy than, let's say, Indiana, we give Kentucky a baseline and Indiana a baseline, and when Indiana repeals certificate of need, let's look at the change in these outcome variables in Indiana and compare that to the change in Kentucky, say. So these is sort of like kind of a, not exact, but sort of like a treatment control groups. The treatment group would be the states that change their CON laws, and the control group would be those that do not. And we see what happens to each of the, quote, patients, end quote. And Kentucky is in these studies. They're typically, obviously, would be in the so-called, what I'm calling the control group that hasn't changed its CON laws. So there are two, there's more than two reviews, but two reviews I'm going to point to of this. One of the studies is one summarized in a Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice document of 2016 that I referred you to here, as well as the Institute for Justice review and survey that was referred to earlier that I think probably has been sent to you, I believe. You probably all have. So I want to talk about specific findings and what the arguments have often been in favor of CON as being, certificate of need, as being an exception to the rule of the need for competition. First of all, sometimes there's a claim that certificate of need reduces healthcare costs, but the studies are suggest that this, in fact, pretty strongly suggest that this, in fact, is not the case. Most studies find that certificate of need does not restrain items such as per diem per case or per capita hospital costs, and often are associated with increased costs. Second question is about certificate of need and the quantity or the amount of health care provided. Studies imply that certificate of need does not promote more health care provision and generally less. So I cite as an example here the Institute for Justice study review of 80 studies. 63 indicate a reduction in supply of health care services and 11 show no change. And this again applies to such things as on per capita basis, fewer hospital beds, fewer admissions, fewer physicians, and fewer imaging services. Now, what I think this indicates is that, of course, the outcomes here of this healthcare or social science outcome is not majority rule, right? There's some outcomes that in fact do and have occurred, and so this requires more than one study, and but the preponderance of these studies shows, in fact, the quantity of health care provision is lower with certificate of need. Now, perhaps the two questions, or actually I got two on this page, one on the next, that are most contentious, or most serious perhaps, is the question of whether or not certificate of need laws improve health care availability to the underserved. Many have contended that, and that is in contention here by some on this committee, it seems. So the studies that are out there show no clear pattern of more access to the underserved in certificate of need states. In fact, I quote here from the Federal Trade Commission Department of Justice study, quote, "Although advocates of certificate of need laws might seek to promote indigent care, the evidence does not show that certificate of need laws advance that goal." again, this is the evidence regarding states that have less or have reduced their certificate of need restrictions. The other comment I have on this slide, does certificate of need improve the quality of healthcare provision? Most studies show that diminished or unchanged quality of care in certificate of need states as measured as such things as rehospitalization rates and mortality rates. Again, to quote the Federal Trade Commission Department of Justice study, they conclude, quote, the weight of this research has found that repealing or narrowing certificate of need laws is generally unlikely to lower quality, and it may, in fact, improve the quality of certain types of care. And then somehow does certificate of need help address market imperfections? There are many interferences in the marketplace in healthcare. There's no doubt about that. And there are some issues here that apply not only to healthcare, but other markets as well, such that consumers are oftentimes not very well informed. There's government or third-party insurance that are in the middle of this, and there's a host of other federal and state regulations as well as constraints by insurance. So does the entry-limiting activity of certificate of need, that is prevention of new providers in many cases, does this help address these issues? And I don't see any clear reason how this helps consumers with their decision-making or eases the handling of other regulations. And the evidence suggests that it does not improve the quality of healthcare provision. So this is my concluding slide. I conclude that the arguments made to justify certificate of need, do not stand up to careful examination. That is the entirety of the evidence. That we're trying not to cherry pick the evidence, but look at its entirety. And again, my conclusion here is that the benefits of competition into healthcare markets and entry into healthcare markets is not rebutted. Of course, every state's situation is unique, including Kentucky's situation, but I think the weight of the evidence suggests pretty strongly that Kentucky would be well served by the improved access to healthcare that is stimulated by the removal of certificate of need. That's all I have. Thank you.